mental health, spanning psychiatry, environment, and consciousness, while informing the next generation of human-centered AI. Recognized as a CFAR at the CLE GRUBER Scholar, Dr. Dumas also contributes to science policy and public engagement by advising governments and international organizations on AI and digital health, and by regularly serving as an invited expert at the United Nations on Cognitive Freedom and the societal implication of emerging technologies. Wow, what a bio. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are very happy that you are coming back to Florida Atlantic University, and maybe you can keep us a little bit ahead of the game in what you are doing as a research right now, and particularly the social interaction between human beings, biological brains, and how we can expand that into AI and agentic AI. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. So you can hear me properly, right? Yeah?
Yeah.
And can you see the slide as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to be virtually back at FIU and had the opportunity to share some past, present, and future research through the lens of this neuro AI field, an emergent field in terms of name, but I would say like, and I will illustrate how it has been in the air for like a long time anyway. But clearly the social dimension of it has recently been taking more and more the headlines with the rise of OpenCloud and Moltbot, for instance, Moltbook, if you have followed this kind of news. And of course, like the pervasive presence of AI agent in our daily lives and society. And well, my research has been focused on social cognition for decades. And I love to start with this slide and emphasizing how, well, it takes a village to do all this work. And typically, part of this village is in Boca Raton here with Scott Kelso, our regretted Emmanuel Tonioli, and Mengzhen Zhang, with whom I had like pleasure to work and collaborate and mind jazz for more than 2 years during my postdoc. I like this slide also to illustrate not only the topic of my work, which is really the social aspect of human cognition, human intelligence, with this word Ubuntu that comes from South Africa. That means I am because you are. Some know it by the Linux distribution, but before being a Linux distribution, it's this very powerful word. And to me, it illustrates both the topic of research and the way I see science in general, like and how mind jazz and collaborating with fellow curious mind is basically what wake me up every day. And moreover, now being a lab director, I had the chance to have my little village in Montreal. So here are the faces of this little village, the PPSP team, also the Precision Psychiatry and Social Physiology team, where we're trying locally to build a interdisciplinary research at the crossroad of many fields, from theoretical neuroscience and mathematics, deep learning, to psychology, clinical work, and social neuroscience. And so to set the stage, like I love this quote from Francisco Varela in one of his last book chapter that illustrate well the problem I'm trying to approach. So it does not cease to amaze me how some philosophers of minds have spent liter of ink on debates about how to prove that you have a consciousness and that we are not surrounded by zombies. Quite frankly, I find this ludicrous. The issue is squarely upside down. The presence and reality of others is so intimately close that the pertinent question is, how can we ever come to have the notion that we are that separate and distinct? And so as human beings, we are like extremely social. We are built through our social interaction with others, starting with our families. And how we do end up even discussing the fact that others may be zombies. And well, we're going to see. In this book chapter, on top of the very thought-provoking citation that I just read, Varela also pushed that this problem of other minds and social cognition in general has been a thread in the history of cognitive science, coming from others as a problem at the early days of computationalism or naive computationalism, to seeing others more as affordances, opportunities of interaction with more like ecological psychology and embodied cognition. And in this graph, I mean, he died in 2001, but he was seeing like a potential evolution towards others as interbeing. And so where others are not just something outside the inner cognitive ability that we have a task or opportunity to interact with, but as more like a constitutive dimension of our cognition, our subjective experience. And so recently, we have published a paper that took me more than 10 years of elaboration on trying to investigate what it meant by this generative neurophenology. And what we end up describing is how the neurophenological program that initially Varela was starting to try to negotiate this double constraint between first-person experience of the subject and third-person study of the human brain can take another level at the intersubjective level, where like the same double constraint that would exist between the mind and the body exists also between agents through interpersonal dynamics or coordination dynamics, in the words of Scott. And in this sense, this interbeing space that is the in-between, or AIDA in Japanese, is the topic of my research. And so like in this paper, we're explaining how there is a zeitgeist. There is like despite many people have been talking about this, including Varela, but even other philosophers, now is the time to study that, because we have the tools, not only at the paradigmatic level in the design of experiment and in the phenomenological methods, but because we have also multi-person neuroscience and we have a computational lens that allow to tackle this very interesting interbeing space. And that would be more like the focus of my talk today, and using this computational lens as a bridge towards AI. So social interaction takes place in humans, between humans and machine, and between machines. Over the years, like the way we try to operationalize this research has been to first design experiments, typically using hyperscanning, so multi-brain recordings. At the formal level, using computational models, and typically dual brain simulation. So instead of doing virtual brains in isolation, to try to simulate multiple brains with their body in interaction. And now in AI, it's through multi-agent reinforcement learning simulation. And at the interface between those two, in human-machine interaction, and typically the focus of the postdoc that I did at FIU was this new paradigm that we call the human dynamic clamp with Scott Kelso, that is like a human interacting with a model of a human in real time. And so pushing even the human-machine interaction, not just as an application, but as a fundamental tool to question and inquiry our understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be interacting with another agent. So let's start with the hyperscanning. And for those who are not familiar with that, I mean, the concept was already motivated by research in developmental psychology, typically mother-infants interaction. My former PhD advisor, Jacqueline Nadel, for instance, studied how 3-month-old babies are allowed to disentangle a real-time video of their mother from a pre-taped recorded video of their mother, thus showing how very early in life we are able to disentangle real-time mutual and reciprocal dynamics from a pure unidirectional one. And so that would be a form of behavioral hyperscanning. And what we did during my PhD at that time was to recycle this dual video system, but add a dual EEG system to bring social interaction in the neuroscience lab and record the brain activity of two people where they were interacting. And so you can see on the right, the software that we used at that time, where I spent like 11 months annotating frame by frame interaction of people. Now, fortunately, never again through computer vision, we can do that automatically, but it took a labor of love to annotate that in the first place. And you can see how those two people, they can see only the ends of the other, but there is like a kind of turn-taking and dance in their imitation of hand movement that emerge spontaneously of the interaction. And even without words, there is this kind of leader-follower dynamics and turn-taking that emerge. So using those data, we first show that, I mean, it seems like obvious right now. It was not necessarily obvious at that time, that the social neuroscience was studying the social brain from a very perceptual and spectatorial perspective, while in fact, being engaged in an interaction is not the same as perceiving a social stimulus. And so like at that time, like 90% of social neuroscience was about having faces or emotional faces. So like passive stimuli. Some were like starting to introduce video and imitation of video like Jacoboni, but interaction, true interaction and reciprocity was not there. And so we show that when the brain was involved in an interactive situation, the role that you take and the context in which this interaction unfold was even modulating the neural correlate. So showing that it's even deeper than just social perception is different from social interaction. Even social interaction takes different flavor at the neurodynamical level depending on context and role. And we replicate that even in fMRI. And one of the key take-home message from the intra-brain analysis were to show that when you are spontaneously interacting with someone, there is a reward intrinsically in this interaction that is not present in a forced unidirectional interaction. And so after this kind of work, I've been collaborating with people in educational science on how, for instance, peer learning can tap into this intrinsic reward of social interaction to motivate learning, for instance. And instead of a more like unidirectional type of teaching, like it's commonly used. Ironically, it's also how we are doing these kind of conferences, but you have to understand that even if we are like in a more like unidirectional setting, I can still see you on the video nodding or frowning, and there is still a back channel and still an interactive context compared to just the people who are on YouTube and watching passively, and I don't know what they are doing. So it's a very subtle gradient from social perception to true spontaneous social interaction where there's a mutual co-appropriation of what's going on. But coming from the lab of Varela, I was also strongly inspired by how brain dynamics is not about just activation and neural correlates, but could be also in the synchronization, the coordination between neural assemblies. Later on, of course, I developed that even further with Scott with coordination dynamics. But already in the work of Varela and with the paper, for instance, from Reño Rodriguez on perception shadow, they were showing that the moment of awareness of a stimulus was more attributed as this like broadcasting and large-scale integration between neural assemblies rather than just increased activity in the gamma band. And so they were the first to show that maybe the next metaphor, because there's always a next metaphor, like every theory is doomed to be replaced by a better one, of the brain as a computer was more like the brain as a network. Now we are completely into this kind of metaphor, like to see the brain as a network. But at that time, it was extremely pioneering to compare, especially the brain as a peer-to-peer network. So at that time, there were no cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. So they were using the word Napster. It was like an old peer-to-peer network to hack MP3 and music. But the idea was to show that we can conceive cognitive function without having a central operating center, and more as an emergent property of cell assemblies. And so using the same kind of tools, we were able to demonstrate that when we are interacting with other people, those synchronization actually happen also between other brains. And it's not like telepathy here, it's mediated with perception and action, but it showed that two nervous systems during a social interaction can be tightly coupled at the dynamical level up to a high frequency band. And that was like a big problem. It took me like 12 years to understand why we can have gamma band synchronization between two brains. But we have now explanation. I will go back to this later. But the take-home message here is that we can see the dyad not as two persons apart, but as a constitutive system where like the two people act as one. And so like that's the model that took 12 years to publish to explain why we can have gamma band synchrony between two brains, while the behavior is much slower than gamma. So with Quentin Moreau, we published a paper in Journal of Neurophysiology showing how the theta coupling that is not controversial, like theta oscillations are actually mirroring velocity of movement. There's like a Nature paper by Scott in 1998 with Armin Fuchs on that, showing the motor equivalence in the motor cortex with the velocity of theta band. Well, so when we are interacting with people, we have this theta coupling that is low frequency and it's not controversial. But over the last 10 years, we have been increasingly understanding how this slow theta activity is nesting gamma activity, faster gamma rhythm. And so in this model, we show that the interbrain synchronization in the gamma band reflect this theta coupling plus within brain cross-frequency coupling. And so like something that has been used actually to question even the whole field of hyperscanning, which is this gamma band interbrain connectivity, and that I was transparently reporting multiple times as robust observation, is not at all that we are coupling two systems in the gamma band, but they are like mediated by these slower oscillations. So it took like a lot of time initially to publish that one. So it took like 14 submission, and even people were calling this parapsychology at that time. But over the years, like we show that this interbrain synchronization actually happened in different social settings. So from nonverbal, we moved to language. With Alejandro Perez, we show, for instance, that speaking the same language, your native language compared to speaking the same language, but not native language, increase actually the alignment of semantic representation between brains, and how these interbrain synchrony are enhanced when you are speaking the same native language with another person. With Ruth Feldman, we show that the familiarity of the person that you are doing the task with and the type of task also change those patterns in a non-trivial way. So it's not because you know better the person that it's always increased in terms of interbrain synchrony. So in the case of motor task and sensory motor task, the more you know the person, the more you're synchronized. But in the case of empathy giving task, it's not the case. So like the romantic couple compared to best friends and stranger were less synchronized in empathy giving task. And we have ongoing discussion with couple therapists on how, for instance, in a couple, you internalize a model of the other person. You don't rely anymore on the present moment nonverbal situation, but more like predict stuff, interpreting with your internal model. And so part of couple therapy is to change those prior about the other person. Well, if you are like a stranger or a friend, you may less rely on this internal model. So that shows that interbrain synchronization is not a monotonous and monolithic phenomenon. It takes different shapes depending on the task and the familiarity with the other person. And then like this paper with Pavel Goldstein and Simone Chametsuri was to me like a double milestone. So first, we show that through affective touch, we are able to lower the pain of another person, which is in the literature of care extremely important, especially in those days where we are like increasingly relying on AI and want to have chatbots and so on. Like the fact that to have touch and affection shown in a physical embodied way, we show that it has an impact on the phenomenology of pain. And further, this paper demonstrates that interbrain synchrony is an objective marker of the level of analgesia that you obtain with affective touch. And it's a double interesting result because people who were like initially questioning the even feasibility of this interbrain synchrony then moved to a more like, oh, that's trivial. There is nothing interesting scientifically. It's just entrainment. So like the fact that the brains are synchronized is just they are entrained to rhythmic aspect of the environment of the task. But here, the task was intrinsically non-rhythmic. So like it was not stroking, it was holding the hand. So there were no rhythmicity in the task per se. But still, interbrain synchronization was a robust objective marker of the level of analgesia that we obtain. Thus questioning that we can just boil down to just entrainment. Using another senses that is not rhythmic, smell, we work with also Ruth Feldman from a developmental perspective, showing that babies get fooled by body odor of their mother when they interact with another mother that is not their real one. So we had like the mother sleeping 2 days in a row with the same T-shirt, and then the baby was interacting either with their real mom or another mom wearing the T-shirt with the body odor of their mom or a blank T-shirt. And we show that the other mom with the body odor of their real mom showed the same level of interbrain synchronization compared to the other mom with the blank T-shirt. That's showing like that at the early time in life, body odor and olfaction may be like a core sense at the social level for the baby. And we show actually in this paper that is not explainable trivially by breastfeeding or food. It's really like the identity of their caretaker through the other. Of course, like ultimately, I would love to do that with father also. I'm also a father of a young Anouk, and I'm very curious about how it worked with also fathers. So that's the next step. Same with Ruth Feldman with our lab. We also show, and that's ironical to say that on video conferencing, but how communicating through video conferencing attenuate the interbrain synchronization. So we show that indeed, like when you are interacting through Zoom, you have to compensate all the time a jitter and a delay that is intrinsically backed into the technology that does not happen in face-to-face interaction. And we have like still brains that are 40,000 years old in a biological sense. And our social cognitive ability are being shaped by evolution to happen without delay. And so this paper was kind of showing that introducing artificial delay may interfere with our ability to match social information between self and other. It may be less problematic in a more unidirectional settings like this one, like watching a movie or a video. But I don't know if you try to sing Happy Birthday on Zoom with 10 people. I encourage you to make the experiment one day. You're going to find very difficult because the delay between the different videos are different and so on. And so that shows the subtlety of the fine-grained dynamics of interaction through this communication-mediated, technological-mediated communication. And following this paper, actually, even reach out and work with UNESCO on how to have also a precautionary principle on using those technology for education in young ages, because more than causing a Zoom fatigue in adults, I'm convinced that this kind of interference may be problematic when the brain is still in development. So like, I know like a lot of states are extremely motivated to deploy telemedicine and remote education because of cost and deployment and scaling. But in certain until a certain age, it may actually interfere with the development of social cognitive ability. So we need to be with a precautionary principle in that. So, well, you see that there's a growing interest in this multi-brain neuroscience field over the years. Our first paper were at the early days in 2010, 2025, there were more like the 100 papers published in that. And I always remind people that actually the first recordings of multi-brain happened in the 60s, but at that time it was published as a parapsychology paper in Science. So at the time you could pretend to have demonstrated telepathy in Science with a one-sentence abstract, and as data just a photo of EEG traces. Of course, it has never been replicated, and I think it may be explained why hyperscanning in the early stage was considered as a parapsychology and weird thing. But so to avoid this slippery slope, we have been very active to push for common practices in the community, to build a community of practice and good practice, both in terms of hardware, so how to build your hyperscanning and multi-brain recordings for different brands, initially in EEG, but now I'm helping a lot for FNIRS as well, and at the software level. So I started the first open source library for hyperscanning, and over the years we have integrated all the metrics that have been proposed. We are integrating even new stuff right now, like FNIRS, language, decoding, and so on. And the idea and the paper itself was also to describe the right way of designing an experiment and the proper statistics to apply for these new types of analysis. But beyond hardware and software, we need also like conceptual clarity. So at the philosophical level, with my colleague Merle Verhaus, for instance, we worked on what does it mean when you are recording multi-brain neuroscience? Like, what does it mean to have synchronization between two brains or two systems? And now, like, even you can even wider your perspective, because some people are using even those tools to do that between artificial agents. But so you're measuring the similarity of the two systems in terms of behavior, like they're doing the same task, in terms of structure, and typically neurobiological structure. So my lab is voluntarily in a child hospital, and I'm working on neurodevelopment and autism, and how diversity at the structural level may impact our ability to communicate with others, but also at the cultural level. So there are like increasing amount of data showing how culture shape and scaffold the way you interact with others. And in that sense, like, for instance, there is a work of Kitayama showing how interaction in Japanese is different at the neuroimaging level from interaction between Americans, for instance. So there's like a cultural constraint on the brain dynamics during social interaction. And on the other side, what you're measuring is communication, coupling and exchange of information, whether it's unidirectional or reciprocal. And the challenge is to understand how the similarity of the two systems play a role in facilitating this communication. So typically in autism, how the neurodivergence at the structural level may explain the difficulty or the challenges sometimes in social interaction and communication. And then another question that we are also trying to study in the lab is how communication between agents is actually creating culture. So like how we can simulate culture in artificial agents, and how we can also study the emergence of culture. The emergence of culture in artificial agents or in real humans, of course. So last but not least, beyond a conceptual clarification, we need explanation. What are the underlying mechanisms behind those interbrain synchronization? And so for that, people have been arguing, typically Janetti and Novembre, how we need to go beyond hyperscanning and multibrain recording and go to multibrain stimulation. You have a very nice example on the right with two mice that are artificially synchronized with optogenetics on the top and stimulated but not synchronously at the bottom. And it was like one of the earliest demonstration of causal impact of interbrain synchrony on social behavior. So like we moved from this parapsychology and it's impossible to, that's just a marker of entrainment, to maybe it's a social marker, to maybe it's actually a mechanism. And so like over the 15 years of research, these interbrain synchrony have really evolved in the way they were conceptualized and studied in the literature. And what we argue with Quentin Moreau is that we don't need necessarily only stimulation to have a causal interpretation and explanation of those interbrain synchrony. We can use also structural causation. So the work we did with Scott at FIU go in that part where you can study how some brain structure, like the right temporal parietal junctions, are actually structurally implicated in those interbrain synchrony. I will come back a bit on that. And you can also use complete brain simulations, so like pure in silico models, to also have a logical causal understanding of those interbrain synchrony. And I have my colleague Weiji Hong at UCLA that recently had like a couple of papers in Science and Nature back to back. Well, he has like the study on the mice and on computational models to have like a counterfactual understanding of how this interbrain synchrony can capture a shared neural space of representation during social interaction. So that's our gateway also to AI at some point, like this no-brainer condition. In terms of direct causal manipulation, also we are working with my dear colleague Susan Dicker, not only on stimulation, but you can do also neurofeedback. So we have this software called Hybrid Harmony, where in real time you can feedback to the people the level of synchrony that they have between their brains. Susan has been even deploying that in museum. It's pretty interesting, and she collected data on thousands of people with the art installation that try to show how we can have a causal feedback loop. And I'm super interested in how this can be also deployed in a clinical settings, actually. So the two brain in the vat. So like that's more like the computational simulation, and that's going to be our bridge towards AI. Initially, when we simulate those two brains in interaction, the goal was to study how the anatomical structure may explain the similarity of the dynamics and those interbrain synchrony. And at that time, using connectomics, I built like two brains in a vat for the price of one. So what we show is that indeed the structure, the connectome, account for this propensity of being synchronized with other brains. And when you start to depart from this norm of anatomy, the interbrain synchrony collapse. And based on this, I've been working with Leo Shilba and Dimitris Bolis on how this may align with their theory of autism, of seeing autism as a misattunement with others rather than a a condition where like one brain area specifically or one gene is responsible, but seeing it as a process that is changed and misattuned over time during development. So like a difference at the biological level percolate across scales up to the sociocultural level, and those neurodivergent people get misattuned and less able to synchronize with other humans. And we showed that 2 years ago with Quentin Moreau in hyperscanning EEG using data on autistic individuals and neurotypical individuals, and showing that indeed, like the ability of synchronize their brains is categorically changed compared to neurotypical dyads. But interestingly, when you are looking at this interbrain synchrony, and what I was also describing at the beginning, is that it takes two to tango. And so like in a sense, the fact that it's synchronized or not is not explainable only by only one part of the dyad. It's a dyadic system. And we have been like interacting a lot since I came to Canada with patients, partner patients, families, and so on, and also a growing literature on what's called the double empathy problem, on how actually people who are neurotypical are also bad at actually interacting with neurodivergent people. And so it's kind of showing that you can have, if indeed, like an explanation by saying like, oh, the brain of the neurodivergent people is misaligned and it's their fault, but you can also interpret it as like they are part of divergence and the spectrum of diversity of the human brain possibilities, and we can accommodate that as well. So it's a change of perspective in how to conceptualize psychopathology, and especially in case of autism. In the clinical context also, we have been working a lot on the therapeutic alliance, which is like one of the main factor in psychiatry and psychopathology for outcomes, good outcomes. So like the way, for instance, in psychotherapy, that you are building an alliance with the clinician is one of the top factors that guarantee that you're gonna have success in the therapy. But the underlying mechanism is still not well understood. And we have been like collaborating with, for instance, the team of Natalie Napadov at the Harvard Medical School that have been pioneering this in chronic pain setting. And with Lena Adel, who just defended her PhD a couple of weeks ago. It's like my first PhD student from the lab here in Montreal after 5 years. So we were very proud at the lab to have like our first doctor. And Lena did a very extensive review of this literature of interbrain synchrony and therapeutic alliance, showing how the main issue is that we have been oversimplifying the mechanisms of alliance. So as I said before, like thinking that more synchrony is always good, and some of the results that we have actually indicate that decrease of synchrony in psychotherapy can be also good, in the sense that a form of crisis or desynchronization may be very meaningful in psychotherapy and show more progress and outcome over long term. But also like the small sample size and the poor account of variability in brain patterning. So how we deal with that? I mean, like to me, it's a question of integrating different skills, not focusing only on brain activity, but also integrating all the levels that are part of a patient, from its embodiments, even at the molecular level, to the social dimension and the interaction that the patient has with their clinician and their family and their co-worker and so on. And for doing so, we need to combine multi-brain neuroscience with also systems biology techniques. And the computational approaches and AI are a fundamental tool to do that and bridge these two fields. So yeah, breaking news, cognition is multi-scale. I remember doing this joke with Scott a long time ago, and how Christophe Core in this science paper in 2012 was saying how biological systems are indeed characterized by a lot of components, and those components are across very large spectrum of space-time, from nanometer to meter, from microseconds to years. And that indeed, to understand those systems, we need to probe them experimentally and computationally. And I love the end of the abstract in science, which is, this is very difficult. And well, it's very difficult, but we can try to tackle that. So on top, I think like it's not new. So a long time ago in a country far, far away from both of us, France, they were like Claude Bernard, which is like the father of physiology, who already warned us about this problem of different scales at play. And at that time, the early days of scientific study of medicine, physical chemists wanted to reduce living systems to just physical chemical phenomena. And already Claude Bernard, in a sense, as a father of physiology, was also the first system biologist, and already say like, okay, well, in the eye of the beholder, as a human studying physiological function, we see scales, we see genes, we see proteins, we see brain area, and so on. But actually, nature doesn't care about us. Like nature happened, and so like those scales are actually interacting between each other in upward and downward way. And so the challenge is how we can reconstruct what happened in nature without too much projecting our domain of expertise, our funding agencies, our grid of interpretation, and we embrace those different skills. And that includes actually social systems and culture. And so for that, we need also to be careful because I don't know if you're familiar with David Marr's levels of explanation. It's very still those days extremely used to severe different levels of explanation from the substrate up to the computational goals. But this way of separating the physical substrate from the algorithm and the function and the computational goals has been also challenged at the philosophical level. So typically, Karl Kraver, the philosopher I already spoke earlier about the different types of causal explanation in neuroscience, also propose new way of seeing relationship between scales, and maybe separating the physical substrate from the function may be misleading at some point. And we are working in the lab. So Quebec has a huge development in quantum computing right now. Like Gilles Brassard just got the Turing Award a couple of weeks ago for his pioneering work on quantum cryptography and quantum computing. And my lab has the chance to have access to quantum computer. And what we are trying to show is that classical computing has also framed us to think that computation can be separated from the substrate. Because in the classical computing way, what happens with bits in the higher level is totally independent from what's going on with the law of physics at the lower level. But that's not what's going on in the brain. Like we are not at all convinced that what happened at the collective patterns can be totally severed and made independent from the cells that create those coordination patterns. So there's like a both upward causation and downward causation from those collective coordination patterns up to the substrate. And actually, quantum computer is a very nice sandbox for that, because the computation itself is not independent from the substrate. When you use the qubits for doing your computation, that's actually physical qubits that you are using for doing the computation. And there are other examples of exotic form of computing. So we have been also getting interested in thermodynamic computing. That's another form of exotic computing, where like instead of fighting the physics, like Bert Winston-Fuller was saying, like, don't fight forces, use them. Instead of fighting physics to have like up and down state that are extremely energetically costly, you can actually use the physics to do the computation. And I think that the brain is more of that kind, doing computation, but leveraging the physical substrate rather than making it totally independent. And so what we are trying to do is to go beyond this naive computer metaphor, not saying that computation is rubbish, but saying that maybe we have to be expanding the definition of computation. So we are simulating the same systems in classical computers, in quantum emulator of quantum computer and real quantum computer. And one of the question that we are trying to ask is there a difference between the classical analysis and the quantum analysis, or between the simulation of quantum system and the quantum system? If there is a difference here, we are facing a more like epistemological difference. It means like more like the quantum formalism brings something new that is not bound to the hardware and the substrate, but it's more like the formalism of quantum mechanics that is interesting. And there's like a whole field actually trying to understand how the mathematics of quantum physics can be used also for cognitive science without at all claiming that quantum physics has something to do at the substrate level. But if you have like a difference between your quantum simulation and the quantum hardware, there is an ontological difference. That means that actually the substrate has a part in the outcome. And so this is the kind of framework we are trying to develop to test and challenge the naive way of severing the computational level from the substrate level. And that comes from also early days of quantum physics. That's actually one of the readings that Scott gave me when I was in postdoc, a beautiful piece in Scientific American called Problem in Physics with Many Scales of Length. Well, Kenneth Wilson, a Nobel Prize for his formulation of quantum field theory and his foundational work on renormalization group, was able to say also that some problems like phase transition in ferromagnetic system, or many types of phase transition actually in physics, cannot be explained by one scale. You need to have a multi-scale account of the system to be able to understand what's going on at the phase transition. And like through renormalization group, to me, like that's one of the most surprising results of Kenneth Wilson's work, that he was able to predict universality class of phase transition in the universe, even some that were not observed yet experimentally at that time. So like it's like Mendeleev predicting elements without being able to observe them, just by understanding. And here Kenneth Wilson was saying like, well, through this perspective, we can predict that those are like the class of phase transition that can be observed. And they have been like later on for some of them actually observed, not for all. And so with Scott and Emmanuel, we have been trying to elaborate how this multi-scale perspective in cognitive science can be used in multi-scale account in physics can be transferred to cognitive sciences, especially through coordination dynamics framework that Scott has been developing over decades of work, and how dynamics can be like a lingua franca between those scales. And it can be like a link between scales, but it can be also a link between components and patterns. Like so, it's of course in our talk we can dive deeper, but the idea is that dynamics can be also a glue not only about the levels of explanation, but also the type of process that we're looking at. But coming back to a physicist, Richard Feynman on his deathbed wrote on the blackboard this famous sentence, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." And I think like AI is the ideal playground to challenge those theories and like see how we can build those stuff using those theories. And so if you are interested actually by this, like I've been involved in this NeuroMatch Neuro AI course, if you are interested, where we have like even a part called Mysteries, where I walk you through some of the theories of consciousness and how we can use computational modeling to implement them in Python. So it's a fun course. I don't know if you're familiar with NeuroMatch, but it's a great platform for learning both deep learning, computational neuroscience, now neuro AI, and there's even like one on climate science now. And like having this computational approach and using tools from computation, again, is both an amazing opportunity, but we need to be careful to not misunderstood the map for the territory. And that doesn't mean that you are endorsing computationalism when you're using those computational tools. So that's something also to have clearly in mind. And so that brings us to AI and social neuro AI. So how we can use AI as a playground to test the things that I've been talking about. So like the role of dynamics, the role of biological plausibility, and how we can take inspiration from biology, and the role of social embodiment and how we can move away from just chatbots to go to robotics and avatars that are more like embodied. So for the biology, one of the first thing I've been trying to do was to model the global neural workspace theory. So I had the chance to work with Jean-Pierre Changeux when I was in France after my postdoc in FIU. And Changeux was like a neurobiologist who had been doing also like pioneering work in allosteric modulation. He identified like the first structure of the nicotinic receptors and so on. Was also the father of the global neural workspace theory with Stan Dehaene, one of the first computationally implementable theory of consciousness. And so I was extremely interested to model that. And so what we did is how we can model a system starting from the visual cortex up to the social level in a computer that leverage what we know about biology of the brain. And so we start with the visual cortex. We show how, for instance, representational learning requires synaptic epigenesis as predicted. Then how to solve tasks with delete conditioning, we need reward and reinforcement learning. And then when we want to move to trace conditioning, that is one of the tasks associated with access consciousness in the theory of global neural workspace, you need also to have inhibition in the system to have working memory and a stable representation, even in the absence of the stimulus at the visual level. And so the model was able to solve all these tasks up to the trace conditioning that is associated with consciousness, but I was not convinced that my laptop was conscious, honestly. So to me, it was showing how also those models, once you start implementing them, show the limit of what the theory is saying. And so after that, so I'm going to skip that. That is more like clinically relevant, but some people have argued that the missing thing is metacognition. So like having something that is able to do trace conditioning and report about a stimuli is not enough. You need to have a representation of yourself, like a meta representation of your own state. And interestingly, this is also linked to social cognition. So in order to have a self, you need to have also others. And there are different theories that have been proposed. One of them is attention schema theory by Michael Graziano. When I arrived here in Montreal, I've been working with Yoshua Bengio on how to implement that in deep learning. And attention schema theory, like the global neural workspace, is one of these higher order theories that was already implementable. So we went to that, and we took so Michael Graziano in parallel actually did a PNS paper where they implement attention schema for a single observer, like showing how you can have like a controller of attention and that improve the way you are solving complex tasks. But what we did is to use the attention schema compared to other view of awareness and attention, do different implementation of those theories, and how we can learn with those proper architecture to do a social cooperative task. And so we use like this kind of grid world environment with agents are interacting with each other. And we show that the fifth hypothesis, so that corresponds to the attention schema, where awareness is actually a meta loop above attention give the best performance in out of distribution in cooperative tasks. And recently, we have been starting to transfer from attention schema to another higher order theory called self-organization meta-representational accounts, SOMA, by Axel Clearmans. That was already tried to be an extension of the global workspace, like building a meta-representation on the first order network of process of information. And that's super interesting because recently Ryota Kanai in Japan has been showing that maybe we have been also misled on the term meta-representations. Like a lot of people think that meta-representation is a representation of a first order representation. But actually, when you do that, you end up with a problem, which is like, where do you put the limit between what is the first order and what is not? Like, especially when you have different layers in a neural network. Well, where does the first order finish and where the meta-representation start is not clear. And so what Ryota is saying, like you can have a meta-representation that is functional. So typically, for instance, confidence in decision-making is form of a meta-representation that is functionally relevant. But you can also have a meta-representation that is a change of statistical order. Like instead of looking at a representation of information, you are representing a process that is underlying. And so for doing so, we unbury the old technique that Axel Clearmans knew from his early days in Carnegie Mellon and working with pioneers of neo-connectionists like Jay McClelland. And Jay McClelland had these techniques called cascade mode that is something that nobody used anymore. And it was at a time where like GPUs didn't exist. And for computing your forward pass in your neural network, you had to do that one neuron at a time. And so you had like a cascade of activation, like in a biological neural network. And so, of course, like it was more because we had difficulty to compute the whole pass in one clock that now with modern GPU is instantaneous. So you can have like the output instantaneously. But what we say like is like maybe the process of this cascade contain an information of how the information is percolating at the first order. And so we introduce an architecture that we call maps, where we have a first order, we have a second order, and then we have like this cascade of dynamics. So instead of having an instantaneous propagation of information, the second order network can leverage the information of the process happening at the first order. And we show that there's a sort of synergy happening between the first order network and the second order network, but also with the cascade and these dynamics happening. And to finish, I want to go back also to other early days paper by Tim van Gelder that was also kind of questioning our intuition about what computation is. And in this paper in '95, Van Gelder was showing how if we take like a homeostatic system like the Watt governor, the centrifugal governor for the Watt steam machine, here you have like this thing is rotating. This is like a pipe that allow with a valve to regulate the steam engine. And if the steam engine is going too fast, those balls go on the outside. It shrink this, which open this and let steam out. And so this thing is regulating the velocity of the engine without having any velocity representation per se. So it's computing by physically existing, but there is no symbol. There's no like register where like one specific angle would be like the velocity per se. And at those times, there were also like Breitenberg showing how you can have robotics doing very interesting emergent behavior with simple architectures, like the Breitenberg vehicles. And actually, for me, like this book, Vehicles, is with synthetic psychology, is one of the early neuro AI book in a sense. Like he's trying to show how you can use those little robots as a benchmark for theories. And so with Axel Clearmans and his PhD student, Nicolas Cook, we recently had this paper where we use those Breitenberg vehicles, but instead of having activations, we have oscillations. And those oscillators are coupled between each other with the Haken-Kelso-Bunz model. So like the famous model that Scott developed with Hermann Haken and Bunz. And we show that we can train the network to solve not only decision-making tasks, but collective decision-making tasks without having any moment a representation of what's going on as a symbolic level. It's just like dynamics and oscillators coupled between each other. So like the dynamics is doing the computation in an embodied way. And so what was interesting on top of showing that we can have collective consensus and decision-making without a specific computation happening in a symbolic way is that the successful consensus between those agents happen when the interbrain dynamics is even higher than the intrabrain dynamics. And that's showing how the interbrain dynamics that I was discussing earlier can be also an index in artificial agents of successful consensus and successful task completion. So I'm going to finish on a more like controversial side. So we are building those things. We are building robots, embodied. We are using more and more theories from cognitive science and consciousness for having those robots performing more and more complex tasks. But the question is like, are we just building robots that are gonna mimicking to be conscious, or are we building something that gonna ultimately leads to a form of phenomenal experience? So I don't know if you're familiar with those companies, but for instance, there is like a Neo from 1X that is like a humanoid robot that's gonna be soon evolving in your flat to do your chores or bring you a cup of coffees and stuff. But already you can see how chatbots are changing our stance on artificial agents. Like some people are getting married with chatbots. Some people get in folie à deux and getting AI psychosis with chatbots. But we're going to have like soon more than chatbots. We're going to have like robots and humanoids. And so the question of qualia and phenomenal experience is going to become like ethically something challenging. So this is another paper that we did at Mila with Yosha Benjo's team on how we can conceptualize even the qualia of a system from a dynamical systems point of view. And so here we go to the problem of ineffability. When you have an experience as a subject, there is like a kind of ineffability of transmitting to another agent what you're experiencing. And in this paper, we model that as a loss of information from the trajectory that is experienced by the system to the attractor that is reportable and where you can do the operation. And so when you are like having a data integrating in a system, you're having a trajectory of your dynamical system. This trajectory is what the system is experiencing. So it calls the conscious experience. But the thing that can be transmitted to another agent only is the attractor state. You don't transmit the whole trajectory. So how we are experiencing this trajectory is the key problem in a sense. And so I don't have a clear answer right now, but the thing that we have been working in the lab is to chase what some people have called the statistical ghost. So when you use information partitioning in your system, you can identify flow of information from one system to another, but also you can partition how the information can go from one system to the synergy between the two systems, or even how the synergy between the two systems can affect causally the synergy of those two systems in the future. And so this node here in the partition is called the causal decoupling, is what I call the statistical ghost with other colleagues, and maybe like something that is transcending the substrate that is causing it. And so the maths are there. It's not completely workable. Like we are applying that to simulation and to real data, but that's how we are trying to tackle this, how we are experiencing the trajectory and what maybe the eye will experience it, and maybe this is the causal decoupling. And so in that sense, we have recently pushed in a Nature Neuroscience review how maybe the current approaches that focus on signal processing with like phase locking value, coherence, and grandeur causality, and so on, should move to the information theoretical landscape, and how we should measure redundancy, synergy between time series to really properly approach this causal decoupling that happens within us in our brain, but also between people during social interaction. So thank you very much for your attention. Here are like some of the take-home message and open questions that are left. I would especially emphasize that, so this paper, actually it's not more than accepted, it's like actually published, of generative neurophenomenology, is trying to question how consciousness can be also approached in the form of relational and dynamically co-constructed phenomena. And that's more like where like Varela was heading at the end of his career. But from a pure AI perspective, we are also very interested in like what are the proper inductive biases that you need to achieve safe AI. So I didn't discuss about the AI safety, but we are interested, for instance, in detecting collusion of artificial agents and preventing that. And those metrics that we have been developing for human-human interaction can be potentially measured to use in AI safety for detecting collusion between artificial agents, for instance. Thank you very much. I'm all yours for questions now.
That's great. That's a great presentation. Thank you so much, Guillaume. So how about we start with people that we have here first? Guys, have any questions, comments?
I know there was a lot there to break down. Guillaume, I had some technical questions when you were doing the synchronization with the Zoom call. How are you getting those latencies when you have sort of the internet and the EEG in the same system?
So we didn't measure the latency exactly. We are aware that they are existing, but we are not measuring them precisely. But overall, like some people did for hyperscanning, and it's in the range of 65 milliseconds, which is kind of a bummer because like it's lower to be like noticeable consciously. I mean, if your Wi-Fi is dropping, you see it consciously, but so it's below the threshold of awareness, but it's still like extremely high on average. So that's why I think it really interfere with our self-other integration and may become effortful on long term for a meeting, because you have constantly to adapt to this lag that does not exist in face-to-face interaction.
Right. So
what would be like interesting to do is to have inside the lab a control delay and
like a fake internet.
Parameter that, yeah. I don't know how to do that actually precisely, because even for those buffer, I mean, they are interacting with a bunch of threads and so on. So it's like it's always like a jittery delay. It's not like fixed. So
yeah, I really like this idea that you brought up of having the downward causation and how that's missing from sort of classical modeling. What are your thoughts in terms of like Hawkins' synergetics? Do you think that's the same thing as his enslavement principle, or do you think it extends it?
I think like the enslaving principle of Haken in laser is the canonical example of downward causation, but I'm not sure it's representative of all the kinds you can find. In a sense that when we have renormalization groups, for instance, it's not that there's like one scale that prevail on the other. All the scale happen simultaneously. And so there's both upward and downward at many scales.
Right.
So that's one thing. And in the quantum computing example also, I mean, like now that we are like getting our hands more and more in quantum computers and dealing with their inner working, I mean, like those are not lasers, but you have like entangled states that are also changing the individual properties of the qubits. So that's also a form of downward causation to me.
I'm sure you've heard that FAU is getting a D-Wave computer on campus.
Sorry?
Did you hear that FAU is getting our own D-Wave computer on campus?
Ah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah, so maybe we can do some experiments like that.
Yeah.
We were
And like we have been, well, the paper with Anne-Marie Wolf, my postdoc, is also covering the different technology available out there, because like, I mean, like quantum computing is something very more diverse than people may thought. So like, if you go to this preprint, we are making like a full review of all the technology out there. So typically there's like photonics, also architecture like quantinuums that are extremely good in signal to noise ratio. We have been working with IBM Quantum System 1. The D-Wave is more on quantum annealing methods for optimization. So we're a lot more dealing with the family of methods on top. So it's extremely stimulating domain right now. Like there are a lot of hypes also compared to what we are able to do with the hardware. But I think it's like it has to start somewhere. So like when people started with transistor at the Bell Labs, I mean, like that was the beginning of a long trip, but it has to start somewhere.
If you were to propose a simple experiment to start with, what do you think would be?
For the quantum computing?
Yes.
So we are working on typically building oscillators and like coupled oscillators. So that's the early things that can be simulated in a simple way. But we have also papers on reservoir computing and how we can use quantum systems as a reservoir as well for time series forecasting and time series generation. I know a lot of stuff is going on typically at the Cleveland Clinic on more like drug design, but it's more like with the application in oncology and medicine. But for cognitive science, I think like, and coming from, of course, dynamical systems, I think like oscillators are the first building block, so to say.
Do you have any questions? Yes, go ahead.
Hey, about halfway through, you showed a chart about the publications on the topic, and it showed in the early 2000s that the chart went way up. Were these publications all like similar topics, or what were some of the popular topics for those publications?
The publications on hyperscanning, you mean?
I think it was
The graph on the number of
one graph
publications
where
and
the
how they exponentially
charts-
grew after.
Ah, yeah. So that's the
I don't know
this
if it was
one.
not.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, there you go.
Was
Yeah,
that
so
all?
like the 2002 paper was the paper of Reed Montague that called the name hyperscanning. So at that time, he was at Caltech, if I remember well, and what they their proposal was to synchronize two scanners, two fMRI scanners. So that's where like the term hyperscanning come from. Then 2004, it's a science paper by King Casas, where they did that for economic gain, where they did a trust game, and they showed that by recording two brains simultaneously, you can have a better understanding of what's going on in an economic game. But it was more like a turn-based type of interaction. And when we start to 2006, 2007, there's actually in 2007 the PNS paper by Emmanuel Tognoli and Julien Lagarde with Scott Kelso, where they recorded finger coupling. But instead of looking at interbrain synchrony, they had like the interbrain recordings actually. They showed that there were like an internal neural marker called phi that was activated during active coordination compared to when you are like repressed from coordinating with the other agent. And actually, it's funny because that's this paper that made me come to FIU initially, because they had also a Society for Neuroscience poster where they show those interbrain idiosyncratic synchrony, but they didn't add like the statistics to prove that this synchrony were stable enough at that time. And when my paper came out in 2010, I entered in contact with Scott and the team at FIU to bring this type of analysis and to collaborate on that. But interestingly, it ended up like more being about the human dynamic clamp and how to replace one of the brains by a computational model than doing hyperscanning per se, and also developing the conceptual framework with the multi-scale coordination dynamics. And after that, like, I mean, it take off with a lot of different papers. I show you some of the ones I've been working on with different tasks or different settings. But there's also like a growing literature on group hyperscanning that started by Susan Dicker, looking at hyperscanning recording in a class. There's like a current biology paper with her and David Popple that is really nice and show how interbrain synchrony between students in a class are indicative of joint attention and predictive of learning. And there's also like a growing literature now, ironically, in animal research, where like after so many years where people were even questioning the validity of those measures, now we have people like, for instance, Weiji Hong at UCLA that prove that with calcium imaging, you can measure cellular synchronization between brains and how it indicate a shared neural space between the two interactive agents.
Did that answer your question a little bit? After 2010, then it went exponentially bigger. Any other questions, guys? Yes, go ahead.
So why do you think these social interactions are only taking place on the right side of the brain?
I don't hear you very well. It's very far.
He's asking why social interactions you think they're mostly on the right side of the brain? Yeah.
It's still missing some part of the.
Where's the microphone? There.
I was asking like why a majority of the social interactions are happening on the right side of the brain.
Ah, very good question. Yeah. So actually, we have like a recent piece with Anne-Marie Walter, the same postdoc. We are working on computational quantum mechanics and quantum computings. We have a Trends in Cognitive Science paper recently. I should have put that actually here. It's published very recently on intrinsic neural timescales and social interacting timescales. And we show how the temporal parietal junction corresponds to a brain area where like you have the fast timescale and the slow timescale of the brain that converge, and maybe a best fit for mediating social coupling. And so that's more explaining like the posterior versus anterior. But in terms of lateralization, it's that most of those work have been done in nonverbal settings, and in the context of the work I've been doing, for instance, with hand movement or with finger coupling and so on, it's always lateralized on the right RTPJ, strongly because of this nonverbal aspect. So that's one part of the thing. And in terms of lateralization, like, of course, like language versus non-language counts, but there may be also other aspect in terms of spatial versus non-spatial type of cognitions, like the perspective taking and more like spatial rotation may be also more lateralized on the right. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right, do you have anything online?
Well, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic work, Guillaume. Hopefully you'll come visit us here in South Florida soon.
Yeah, with pleasure. I'm now a potential snowbird living in Quebec, you know.
Perfect. Well, we'll trade, right?
And also, like, please ping me if you happen to be in Montreal. There's a lot of cool stuff happening here, and I would be happy to welcome you here in the lab and visiting. Yeah.
That'll be great. Thank you so very much. We'll stay in touch and let us know of your latest publications as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Grab some cookies and muffins. Make yourselves at home. We've got lots of new equipment and projects. If anybody needs projects, let us know. We've got some fun new things. Our newest critter in the lab is this little guy we just got today. And this runs off of ESP32. And in the talk, he mentioned those Breitenberg vehicles. Highly recommend that book that he said. You can find the PDF online. I have it. If you can't find it, it's just called Vehicles. I'm going to pull it up right now.
For it. It's like $100.
No, you can find it. I haven't yet. It might be out of print. So
send me
it's
the PDF.
yeah,
The
we'll,
link I can.
yeah, he's an Italian cyberneticist. His name is Valentino Breitenberg, which is a term you don't hear very often anymore, like cybernetics. It kind of got classified, right? It was kind of what AI was like 100 years ago. And it was used to control what was called gun directors, so anti-aircraft cannons and things like that. And so it wasn't really ever popularized in school, per se. They never really made like a degree out of it. But this Breitenberg vehicle, there's the wiki. Let's see if we can find the actual PDF. It's a great book. It's like here it is on Google Open Books. That's probably just a preview.